Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. We're going to do something different today. We're going to test out a Windows tablet. This is the first one I've ever tried before. I've had iPads, I've had Android tablets, but I've never really been drawn to Windows tablets, mostly because they are more productivity focused. Well, I would argue this one that we're reviewing today, the MinisForum V3, is more gaming focused. For example, the chipset inside, it's the Ryzen 7 8840U. That's the top of the line AMD chipset right now. That's what's coming out in all the handheld PCs that are coming out this year, and so the fact that we have it in a tablet is really revolutionary, at least for me. In addition, it's got a nice screen. It's really big. It's 14 inches. I can barely fit it in the shot, but it's also 1600p resolution, 16:10 aspect ratio, and then also 160 Hz refresh rate. So those are really kind of high-end specs when it comes to a tablet, so I'm really impressed by that. It's also got a couple other features that make it good for gaming, including some really nice cooling, but then also it's super thin and light, but has a good battery in it, 50 watt-hours altogether. And so that all combined really makes this kind of go toe-to-toe with other handhelds on the market right now. And it's just like a really unique idea for me, and the idea that it's a tablet where you could do all those tablety things, you can view your media and all those things I like to do on my iPad, but then if I want, I can just prop this up, hook up a controller, and then all of a sudden I've got a gaming tablet as well. It's also got a couple other unique features to it. For example, it's got display in, so you could use this as an external monitor as well. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, but as you can tell, there's a lot of different use cases for this thing, and even though it does have a bit of a premium price tag, it's actually really competitive in this space, and I don't know, maybe one of these will actually meet one of your needs too. And so let's do a deep dive and just talk about all the different ways that I've been testing this over the past week, and see if one is going to match with you as well. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Alright, let's jump right into pricing first. Now it's $1,200 right now, but it's during a pre-order period. It's going to go up to $1,500 when it hits retail. And there's no bones about it, that is a high price tag. I think that's the most expensive MinisForum computer that I've ever tested. So let's break down all the things that are going to come with this relatively high price point. First thing of note is the price does come with the keyboard case accessory. Most other tablet manufacturers will charge that separately. In addition, there's only one specification available, but it is the highest end. It's 32 gigs of RAM and a terabyte of storage. And also during the pre-order period, it's going to come with an active touch stylus as well as a screen protector and a laptop sleeve. Next, I want to talk about the specs that I didn't cover in the intro. So going back to the screen here, in addition to the stuff I already said, it also has a 100% P3 color gamut and 500 nits of brightness. And the panel itself has a matte finish to it. So if I angle it against my studio lights, you can see that it's not super reflective. It kind of reminds me of the etched glass panel that you can find on those high-end Steam Decks. In terms of brightness and dimness, we've got a pretty good range here. It doesn't get super dim, but it does get very bright. To give you context, usually in most use case scenarios, I've been playing it at about 50% or even down to like 30% brightness, and it's been just fine. Going back to that first specs page, we also have two different cameras. One is 2 megapixels on the front, so you could use this as a webcam, but then also it works with Windows Hello. So if you want to sign into your Windows computer using your face, you can do that as well. And the back also has a camera, and it is 5 megapixels. Moving on to the next page, we already talked about the Ryzen 7 8840U. It has 8 cores and 16 threads, and on this device it has a max TDP of 28 watts. Also of note, the RAM is LPDDR5 and it's clocked at 6400 MHz. But also bear in mind, according to MinisForum, the memory and the storage are not user replaceable. Finally, on this page, the last spec I wanted to bring up is that it has Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.3. And some other things worth noting, it does have an internal gyroscope and also supports up to 65 watts of power delivery charging. So all things considered, I think that's a lot of specs for what you're getting here, although the $1,200 plus price point is still pretty steep. So next, I want to compare it against other high-end tablets that are somewhat similar in that regard. And I bet if you closed your eyes and tried to picture a Windows tablet, you would probably think about a Surface device first. So let's take a look at their high-end model. That's going to be the Surface Pro 9. Now the thing about the Surface Pro 9 is that even at its highest spec, which is going to be the 12th generation Intel Core i7, it still is not going to perform as well as the MinisForum V3. This generation chip is quite a bit older, but then also when it comes to gaming performance, it's it's not going to be able to stand toe-to-toe with the AMD. So if we are looking from a gaming perspective, I would say this is going to be a downgrade compared to the one we're reviewing today. Now, the starting price for this tablet's not terrible. It's a little bit over $1,000. But bear in mind that's the lowest spec, so 16 gigabytes of RAM and only 256 gigs of storage. If we wanted to upgrade it to the same 32 gigs of RAM and terabyte of storage, we're now looking at over $2,000 for that tablet alone. So in this scenario, let's pick the middle ground here with 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage. It's still a bit of a compromise compared to the MinisForum, but the pricing's a little bit more palatable at about $1,300. However, bear in mind that the keyboard and the stylus pen are going to come separately, so they're going to charge you additionally for that. So you're really looking at about $1,600 to get one that's going to have a lower performing chip as well as less storage and RAM. So in a toe-to-toe between these two, I think the MinisForum actually is a better deal. Now, to be honest, when it comes to Windows tablets, there is very slim pickings. Another one that I found was from Asus. This one's quite a bit more expensive, as Asus products tend to be. It's $1,750. However, when it comes to performance, I bet this one is better. It's got an Intel Core i9 and then a laptop GPU. It's got an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 4050. So if you're only looking from a gaming perspective and you want to make sure that you get the absolute best performance you can in a tablet, it does look like this one will probably give you better performance, but at a higher price point. And there are some other interesting things about this one, like the fact that it is compatible with the XG Mobile like the ROG Ally, so you can plug this into an external GPU as well. Either way, between the Surface Pro and this one, I would say this is actually a better comparison against the MinisForum V3. And then finally, because we are talking about high-end tablets, I think it's worth mentioning the iPad Pro as well. If we look at the most recent 12.9-inch model, it's going to come with an M.2 chip, and the price is going to vary depending on how much storage you use. The absolute cheapest is $1099, but that comes with 128 gigs of storage, and on a device that doesn't have an SD card slot, that kind of feels criminal. If we wanted to get 1 terabyte of storage to match what we can find on the MinisForum, we're looking at $1799 for the starting price. So already it's quite a bit more expensive than the tablet that we're reviewing today. And of course, bear in mind that the accessories are not included, so you're going to have to spend $130 for the Apple Pencil and then $350 for the Magic Keyboard. And of course, those are all optional accessories, but if you were to put that all together, it's going to be over $2,200 to get something that's similar spec-wise to the MinisForum V3. Now, there are all sorts of rabbit holes I could go down between like the M2 performance versus something like the Ryzen 7, but as it stands right now, just looking at your price point, I do think this is competitive against the other models. So now that we have an understanding of all the specs and features that come with it and the overall price, let's now look at the actual device itself. And as a disclaimer, this was sent to me by MinisForum for review, but no money was exchanged in any way, and all opinions are my own. And it really feels like MinisForum is putting a lot of heart and soul into the V3. Not only did they tease this device for over 6 months before it launched, but it also comes with a set of custom V3 stickers and then a love letter to me written in both Chinese and English. And I've never seen these kind of pack-ins with a MinisForum device before, which leads me to think that yeah, they really care about this one. Anyway, further inside the box, we have a quick start guide that really just kind of talks about all of its different features. And then it also comes with a rather small 65-watt GAN charger. And then finally, it comes with a USB-C cable, and yeah, that's about it. So now let's take a look at the tablet itself. And first impression, yeah, these are really thin bezels. And you can also see the front-facing camera is right here centered at the top. Next, I wanted to take a look at the back, and first thing I noticed is the active cooling up top, but then also the material on the back feels really good. It has a powdery matte finish to it, and also seems to be fingerprint resistant as well. In fact, over a week of testing, I got a little bit of smudging, but not as much as I expected, so I think the material here is pretty good. Also on the back, you can see on the top left, we have our camera and then a small MinisForum logo. Now the cooling here uses 2 different fans. This is the intake portion, and then it'll push out all the hot air in the top. Up top, all we have are those 2 exhaust vents that I mentioned before, and the bottom is also relatively austere. All it has is the connection port for the magnetic keyboard case. Now on the sides is where all the magic happens. On the left side, we have a 3.5mm headphone jack, then our volume rocker up and down, and then we have a full SD card slot. It's got a little removable rubber thing right here as well. Next, below that, we have our USB-C V-Link port. So this is a display-in port only. It doesn't do anything like connecting any USB accessories or charging charging or anything else like that. And you guessed it, we are totally going to test this later. Now, a little bit further down, you can see we have 2 of our 4 stereo speakers, and that's about it. On the right side, we have our other 2 speakers and then 2 full-speed USB 4 ports. And these can be used for anything, an external display, accessories, or even power. And then finally, we have our power button and then a power LED indicator. And all told, this is a very sleek feeling tablet PC. There's no camera bump or anything else sticking out. It just feels like one piece of hardware, and it feels really nice. It does remind me a lot of an iPad Pro, although it is a little bit heavier. It's about 200 grams heavier, but of course it is larger too. Before we move on, I do want to do a quick audio test. So this is just going to be testing the speakers themselves and the quality that we can get from them. Overall, I would say the audio quality is just kind of mediocre, if not a little bit underwhelming. It's certainly lacking in bass, but it just doesn't feel overall pleasant to my ears. Like, I would not look forward to listening to an album from this tablet. I think it'll be serviceable, for example, if you wanted to watch TV on this and if you're playing a game, but all the same, I'd probably rather just use Bluetooth headphones. Okay, next I want to look at the accessories that came with it. We'll start with the keyboard attachment. Now, I actually got a preview of this device a few months back when I went to CES, so I kind of know what I'm getting myself into. And I remember that the company said that the person who designed their keyboard is the same person who designs the keyboards for Apple as well. And I think that even if they hadn't told me that ahead of time, I would have felt the same way, because yes, this feels very much so like a Magic Keyboard for the iPad. We'll start with the trackpad. Now this does physically click down, and you can kind of click it anywhere and it's going to be a similar feeling. And I think it feels pretty good. I'm not a huge fan of trackpads in general, but I do like the fact that it's large and that it does have a physical click. Now the keyboard itself feels great to me. I've owned a Magic Keyboard for the iPad for about 4 years at this point, so I'm very used to this overall feel. And because this tablet is larger than an iPad Pro, it actually feels roomier to use this keyboard compared to something like the Magic Keyboard. So no complaints here when it comes to the overall feel, and yes, we'll do some more testing later. Of note, MinisForum is really getting into the whole AI features thing from AMD, and so it even has a dedicated Copilot button right here. Now the way the keyboard attaches is pretty simple. It's all magnetic. So all you have to do is just kind of get it close to where it needs to be and it will snap into place. And the connection between the two is very flexible. It kind of feels like leather or something similar to that. So it definitely doesn't have enough strength to, for example, hold the tablet up from the keyboard case alone. For that, you're going to need the other half, which is what they call the V3 stand. And this will also come with a device when you purchase it. So this is magnetically connected, so all I have to do is just kind of snap it into place. And from there, you've got a whole range of motion where you can bend it to put it at any angle you would like. Now, admittedly, for the first day or so, I was totally using this thing wrong. I was kind of treating it like a Switch OLED or even a Lenovo Legion Go, where I was trying to use it like a kickstand. And I gotta say, that left me really confused, because when you use it like this, you're going to be covering up the intake fans. And initially I thought, man, this is a terrible design decision, because how are they going to get any sort of cooling into the tablet? And so I really couldn't fathom why they spent so much time coming up with the design of this device and then covering up the cooling. It didn't make any sense. Well, thankfully I slept on it, and the next day I had a eureka moment. And that is, you're not supposed to bend it from the bottom up, but from the top down. This thing is so flexible that it can go beyond 180 degrees. In fact, it's designed to do that. And once I figured that out, I was like, hey, this is actually a pretty brilliant design, because it exposes all of the air intake so that you can get the best cooling possible while still giving you a lot of support for your tablet. Anyway, I thought it was worth bringing up, because if it took me an entire day to figure it out, it might take you some time as well. Now, one negative I do have for this entire experience is that I feel like the magnets on the keyboard side are not strong enough. In fact, it's surprisingly easy to pull the keyboard part away from the tablet. Another example is that if you just slide it left and right, the case will just come right off. And so there may be some limitations with the strength of magnets that they can use, but either way, these just feel a little bit too loose. By contrast, the magnets on the back are super strong, like they don't move around at all when I try to do the same thing. So I do feel among all of the other design choices, this is the one where it does feel a bit like a flaw. Especially when you think about the fact that the keyboard part is covering up the screen, which is the thing I want to have protected the most. And then finally, one last note in my whole unboxing and impressions is that when you do open up the keyboard part, it does wake up the screen, which is pretty handy. Okay, now I want to move into testing, and MinisForum calls this a 3-in-1, so we're going to test all of the different use cases that they have set up. The first one is what they call laptop style. So the idea here is that you would use this with the keyboard case installed, and then you can use this for productivity or things like that. The next one is what they call the bracket type. So this is when you would kind of prop it up to use it as a tablet, but for our use case, we're going to use it as a gaming PC. And then finally, on the far right, they have what they just call tablet types. The idea here is you'd use it without a case, and so this would be for like drawing or maybe just media consumption. So let's start by testing the laptop style. So all the things that you can do in terms of productivity and just using this like a laptop replacement. And we'll start with a typing test just to give it a feel for how the keyboard behaves in a normal working environment. Now, I'm not the best typist in the world, but I am very used to keyboards like this. Like I mentioned before, I used the Magic Keyboard for years at this point. And so transitioning over to this keyboard was very easy for me. I'm not sure if it's going to be the same for you, but all the same, yeah, I really like this experience. I ended up getting 69 words per minute with no mistakes, and for me, that is pretty good. Now, just to be thorough, I also brought over my iPad Pro and Magic Keyboard just to test this as well. And I do have an unfair advantage here because I have been using this setup for about 4 years at this point. In fact, I've written half a novel on this iPad using this exact same setup. Either way, here I got 68 words per minute, but I had a couple mistakes, so it dropped me down to 66. And so if anything, I think this does go to show that the MinisForum keyboard is pretty solid. The only complaint I have about the keyboard experience on the tablet are the arrow keys. In particular, it's the up and down keys, because they are two half keys, as you can see right here. And there have been many times where I haven't really known where to press, and so I've had to look down at the keyboard, which is something I'd rather not do. So I kind of wish there was a physical bump on the key just to help differentiate it a little bit better. And when you compare it to something like my very dirty Magic Keyboard, you can see that, yeah, this one has the up arrow above the others, and so it makes it easy to identify. Now, I probably will get used to this over time, but at least in my first week of testing, this was something that consistently bothered me. Okay, next let's talk about the trackpad experience and then also combine that with video editing so we can kind of talk about both at once. And like I mentioned, I'm not a huge trackpad fan. In fact, even when I'm going to be using my laptop, which has a trackpad on it, I will just use an external mouse instead. Either way, I did push myself to at least edit one video using the trackpad, and so I just took one of my older videos and I cut it up a bunch and then moved everything around. And I'm using DaVinci Resolve right here, and this is a 4K video, so we're really pushing the limits here of what we can edit. I will admit that it was a little bit sluggish to scroll through some of these settings, but honestly, I don't really know how to optimize DaVinci Resolve because this isn't my primary editor. Overall, I would say that editing 4K footage is definitely doable on this tablet, but it may not be an ideal experience overall. Anyway, after I was done editing everything, I then decided to render it out at a 1080p resolution. And my typical standard will be that I want 1 minute of footage to render in about 1 minute. Now, I definitely threw a curveball here by using 4K footage, but I was really trying to push the most recent processor. And also bear in mind that I'm using this on the power saving setting, so it's only pulling about 15 watts. You could plug it in and use a 28 watt TDP, and I bet that would speed things up quite a bit as well. Regardless, even under these constraints, we got some pretty great performance. It took a 4K video, rendered it out to 1080p, and it took about 1 minute and 10 seconds to do 1 minute of footage. So I would say this is more than capable when it comes to productivity tasks, even some heavyweight video editing like this. So now let's go over a couple use case scenarios and comparisons. We'll start with the fact that this has video out. So if you wanted, you could plug this tablet into an external monitor like this. All I've done is taken a USB-C to HDMI adapter and then plugged it into the monitor. So now I'm using my tablet as a primary PC where it's hooked into an external monitor as well, but then also a Bluetooth keyboard and mouse. This is the kind of setup I tried to set up with my iPad many times in previous years, but it just never really worked because iPad OS isn't really a desktop OS solution. Meanwhile, I could see something like this totally working for most use cases. For this next part, I took out a couple different devices so we could do some size and weight comparisons just to get an idea of what this is going to feel like in the hand. On the left, we have my 12.9-inch iPad Pro. This is the M1 model, so one generation behind, but still a very beefy tablet. In the center, we have the MinisForum V3, and then on the right, we have my MacBook Pro 14-inch. This is the M3 model. This is my primary video editing computer. Let's start with a size comparison. So you can see that the MacBook 14-inch is almost identical in size to the MinisForum V3. There's maybe a millimeter of difference between the two. They are very, very similar. Next, we have the iPad Pro, which is about the same in terms of depth, but is about 2 fingers less than the other two. And that makes sense. This is a 12.9-inch diagonal screen compared to 14 inches on the other two. Now, I did weigh all of these as well, and so let's talk about each of them. We'll start with the iPad Pro. This was the lightest among all of them, so 731 grams on its own, phone, and then 1442 grams with the Magic Keyboard attachment. Next, we have the MinisForum, and the tablet itself is exactly 200 grams heavier than the iPad Pro. And if you're used to holding an iPad, you're going to feel that difference. It is pretty heavy for a tablet, all things considered. However, I did find it surprising that when you add the case, the difference between the two actually gets a little bit thinner, so it's only 1597 grams with the case. It's still heavier than the iPad Pro, but it's actually less than 200 grams of a difference, so it's getting a little bit closer. Now, I was surprised to find that the MacBook Pro is actually heavier than either of them. I actually thought it would probably be somewhere in between the iPad and the MinisForum. Given the fact that the MacBook Pro is impressively light for what it can do, that kind of leads me to think that yes, even though the MinisForum feels a little bit heavy, it's still kind of par for the course when it comes to these high-end laptops or even tablets. And it's a lot lighter than something like the Asus Z1 Flow that we talked about earlier. This one is 2200 grams. Next, I want to compare their thicknesses. Now, this includes the case, but you can still kind of see what the tablets look like without the case as well. The iPad Pro is definitely thinner than the others, but with the case attachment, it's about the same thickness as the MinisForum. This one is a little bit thicker than the MacBook Pro, but not that much. And when it comes down to it, I think that all three of these are relatively thin by today's standards. Next, I want to talk about footprint, like how much space it takes up on a desk. And I'd say the MinisForum and the MacBook are about the same, although the MinisForum does have that flap on the back that's holding it up. And of course, given the fact that it's smaller, the iPad also has a smaller footprint as well. However, the big difference between these three is that only the MinisForum has a detachable keyboard, and that will reduce the footprint significantly. So if you are going to use it in tablet mode, you're going to save a lot of space. The Magic Keyboard is great, but it doesn't have the ability to remove the keyboard itself, and so as a result, if you want to prop up your iPad, you have to use the whole shebang. And of course, it's going to be the exact same kind of scenario when it comes to a laptop as well. So if you are looking for a tablet-like experience without having the keyboard get in the way, then I do think that the MinisForum is a pretty ideal setup. And then the last thing of note in my comparison is just the glossy versus matte feel of some of these screens. Now, my iPad has a glass screen protector, so it is making it even more reflective, but also I think this is a great demonstration of how non-reflective the screen is on the MinisForum. I really like that. And I'd say the MacBook is kind of the middle ground between them in the fact that it's not super glossy, but then also it's not super matte. Okay, so that's all the testing I wanted to do within the whole laptop kind of style. Now let's move over to the next one, which they're calling the bracket type, but this one's the most exciting for me because I think this is what I would call the gaming type instead. Before we jump too far into that, I did want to show off the DisplayPort in. This is kind of unique because you can't do it while the device is turned on. The device has to be fully turned off. And what you'll have to do is take a DisplayPort capable device like a Steam Deck and then use a DisplayPort cable as well. From there, you'll plug it in from your host machine over into the tablet, and it should immediately pick up that signal, and then it's going to turn on the monitor, and that's about it. And it's a very simple setup. You'll even be able to adjust the volume from the device itself. Now, one thing of note, the touchscreen functionality does not carry over. So for example, here with Fallout 3, you have to actively touch the play button. And as you can see, it is not carrying over. So in this scenario, you'd want to unplug the display, then have it show up on the Steam Deck again, and then tap it yourself. And after you get through that menu, you can just plug it right back in, and now you're good to go to actually start playing a game. And I think it's pretty funny to be able to play like a Steam Deck game on a tablet that's also capable of playing the same game at the same time. But all the same, I really like the fact that they included this functionality because even though I personally can't really think of a use case where this would be necessary, I think it's still really cool that other people might. And this will work with any DisplayPort capable device, even an Android device. For example, my Odin 2, I can plug it up and I'm immediately into Emulation Station and I can play all my favorite retro games. And I would expect the battery life in this type of scenario to be pretty decent. I would say maybe 6 to 8 hours altogether. Alright, before we move into the gaming part, let's talk about the software experience because MinisForum now has their own app. And this will allow you to monitor a lot of things with your computer, but to be honest, a lot of this is just a readout of some of the settings that you can find within Windows. And so even though it is neat that you have everything all in one place, I can also access all of these things myself by knowing which app to go into within Windows 2. The only thing I found that's truly unique is within System Manager, and then there's a select mode option. This will allow you to adjust the TDP as well as the refresh rate of your screen. And they've got 3 different profiles. One is called Power Balance. This will give you an 18 watt TDP, and then there's also one called Power Save, which will drop it down to 15 watts. And if you plug it in, it'll give you access to more features. For example, you can now use Power Premium. And when you tap on this, it is going to black out the screen for a moment, and that's because it's changing the refresh rate of the panel. This will give you the full 28 watt TDP, but then also a 165 Hz refresh rate. And if we keep it plugged in, but then move over to the Power Balance tab, you can see that this one also had an increase of TDP up to 22 watts from 18. So you do have different power profiles depending on when you're plugged in and when you're not, and we'll go over all that when we do our game testing too. And of note, you're not tied down to this app either. You can always change this stuff manually by using a third-party app for the TDP, but then also you could just go into the Windows settings under Advanced Display and change the refresh rate there as well. So you still have the same freedom that you've always had when it comes to adjusting your display settings and your TDP profile. It's just that they've made an app to simplify the process if you don't want to get into the weeds. Okay, next we'll move into the gaming portion. So here I really tried to figure out how I could show the best use cases overall, and I decided for the most part to do my testing with a 15 watt TDP. And I'll show off the battery results at the end of the video, but in general, just think of 15 watt TDP of giving you about a little over 2 hours of battery life altogether. So let's take a look at how that performance is going to look at a 15 watt TDP. When it comes to lighter weight games, you'll be able to play these no problem at 60 frames per second, even with a higher resolution like 1200p and sometimes even 1600p. However, when you start pushing it into more graphically intensive and 3D games, I would expect to drop down the resolution to make sure that you get a good frame rate. And I found the sweet spot for this device to be 800p, so that's going to be the half resolution of the full display, but I think it looks really good, especially at the viewing distance that you'll have this when you're playing any game, and so as a result, yeah, I really enjoyed playing these games in 800p. It's definitely not the sharpest experience, but it's pretty cool to be able to play Control at a pretty consistent 60 frames per second, and it's also great to get even higher results. For example, with Doom Eternal, I was getting an average of about 85 frames per second, which is pretty impressive. And overall, I found this to be the most consistent experience, where I can get a solid 15 watt TDP and about 2 hours of battery life. But then also you'll get a pretty good frame rate for most games as well, and I think that 800p still looks good on this tablet too. For God of War, I was getting average about 55 frames per second. For me, this is definitely playable, but of course, if you want to have something more consistent, you'll have to throw more power at it. So let's drop into those settings really quickly and then go into the Power Premium setting. This will bump everything to that full 28 watts. And then here again with God of War, I've kept it capped at 60 frames per second, but you can see that it is very stable now. And so there's kind of two ways to play these games. One is going to be on battery power, which I would recommend to be about 15 watts, but if you're going to plug it in, you might as well crank it up. And so let's look at that performance for a few games. With God of War, like I mentioned, it's a very consistent 60 frames per second. But for other games, you can up that resolution and it'll still get you a better frame rate. For example, with Risk of Rain 2, we're getting an average of about 100 frames per second at 1200p with medium settings. And this experience looks awesome on this big tablet. Now there's always going to be limitations when using an APU, especially with newer games. Helldivers 2 is a great example. This one really chews through anything that doesn't have discrete graphics. So even at 800p and medium settings, I was getting an average of about 40 frames per second. It's still playable, but definitely not like a premium PC experience. However, one thing to bear in mind is that we have full USB 4 ports, which means that if you took an external GPU like this one right here, I reviewed this last week, it's called the 1X GPU, this works perfectly fine with the tablet as well. And this will give you options when it comes to adjusting the performance one way or the other. In this particular example, I decided to increase the resolution to a full 1600p. So here under high settings, we're still getting about 40 frames per second, so not super perfect gameplay, but you have to remember I'm pushing a lot of pixels into this tablet right now. Either way, I think this is a good demonstration of the kind of flexibility that you will get if you use an external GPU or you also plug it in with power. Now, one feature I really wish we had with this tablet, because it has a 1600p resolution, is the ability to use integer scaling. Now, you can actually adjust this manually by editing the registry configuration, but I would rather not have to do that. In fact, a lot of people did that with the Lenovo Legion Go, but then afterwards, AMD actually included it within their software. And it appears that this was something that Lenovo kind of worked out with AMD, and so they had it in the settings with the Lenovo Legion Go. Unfortunately, here with the tablet, we don't have those same options. And so as part of this review, I'm going to send a note over to MinisForum and ask that they can talk to AMD and see if they can get something set up, because that would be amazing. This means we'd be able to play our games at 800p, but the scaling would look a lot better than it does right now. So if I had a wish list of all the things I'd like to see in this tablet, that's really high up on the top for me. Okay, let's go back and do some more game testing, but this time let's talk about game emulation. This is always one of my favorite things to test. And one of my favorite things about this tablet is the fact that it has a 16:10 aspect ratio. That means that 4:3 content is going to fill up a lot of the screen, especially compared to 16:9. And so when it comes to retro game emulation, this is a pretty ideal aspect ratio, so I'm happy to see it here. On top of that, this makes Game Boy Advance games look incredible, because these played at an original 3:2 aspect ratio, and 16:10 is pretty close to that. And so as a result, these games natively will just fill up the entire screen. It looks amazing. Next, let's talk about some of the harder games and emulation performance. We'll start with Sega Saturn. This is running the accurate Beetle core, and you can see here that it's really not taking a lot of power to play this at full speed, about 7 or 8 watts altogether. Moving on to GameCube, we're going to run this at a 3x resolution. That's going to be just under 1600p, and as you can see right here, it's working great. It's only pulling about 10 watts TDP as well. Next up, we have PS2 emulation. We're going to use the Vulkan backend, again at a 3x resolution. And yeah, same thing here. It's running great and not pulling a lot of power. I was surprised to find that Dragon Quest VIII played at a 3x resolution and only pulled about 6 or 7 watts of TDP. Now let's move into the next generation. We'll talk about Wii U first. This one also doesn't require a lot of power for most games. Here I'm playing Legend of Zelda Wind Waker HD at about 11 watt TDP profile at a 1080p resolution. It looks great. Next, we'll try Breath of the Wild on the Wii U. This is going to be at 800p with a 60 frames per second cap, and I'm also running this on battery power, so it's going to max out at 18 watt TDP. Even then, I think the game is playing great. We're getting an average about 48 frames per second. It's not a full 60, but it's still going to feel really good. Another system that does pretty great at an 18 watt TDP is PS3. In fact, even Infamous, which is one of the hardest games to play, is well above 30 frames per second. And if you wanted to get this closer to a 60 frames per second when plugged in, you could then bump it up to a 28 watt TDP, and I think most PS3 games are going to play great. One system that definitely requires that full 28 watt TDP is going to be Xbox 360. This emulator in particular is pretty power hungry. But even then, I found this to be excellent when it came to Xbox 360, just like the 7000 series of APUs that came out last year. I also did just a tiny bit of Nintendo Switch emulation using the Ryujinx emulator. I started with the 18 watt TDP, and I found that most games played just fine. I did get some slowdown when it came to shader compilation, but it wasn't as bad as I was expecting, and I would say this is fully playable. Of course, if you want to make sure that you have even better performance, then you can also bump up the TDP to 28 watts, and then that'll probably smooth out some of those rough edges. And then finally, another thing I wanted to test when it came to emulation is whether or not I could boot into Linux and then play something like Batocera. For this, I had to go into the BIOS and turn off Secure Boot, and then I told it to boot into the flash drive instead of the internal storage. And after that, it booted up just fine, and so yeah, Batocera is totally going to be doable on this tablet. And this is a great setup if you want to have a dedicated emulation experience without having to use the internal storage at all. In this scenario, everything is playing off the flash drive. The emulators, the ROMs, all my configurations are all housed there. And so here I also wanted to push the performance to see what we could get, and yeah, even here with Wii U it's playing great, but then also the original Xbox at a 2x resolution is still playing at full speed as well. So I think this is yet another feature of this tablet which makes it a compelling buy for me, and the fact that I can dual boot it whenever I would like. Okay, and finally, the last part of this segment, I want to talk about the fan and the cooling just because we have been pushing it pretty hard here with this testing. The device is set up with 2 different fans as well as 4 copper heat pipes. And I feel like this cooling solution is kind of overkill because even when I was playing it at a full 28 watt TDP, even when pushing it over sustained time periods, I never saw it go above 74 degrees Celsius. So this is keeping the device ultra cool and relatively quiet. Let's do a quick audio test. And I would say, all things considered, this is pretty darn quiet. My controller is way louder than the fans. And of course, if you turn up the game volume to something like 50%, you won't even hear the fans at all. Let's take another listen. So yeah, overall, even though I don't think the audio is the best in the world, it's still a great experience when you consider the fan noise and everything else. Okay, and finally, let's talk about the last use case scenario according to MinisForum, which is using this like a tablet. And this will 100% be the shortest segment here in this video. And that mostly comes down to the fact that I just don't really ever use these kind of stylus pens. And so I kind of just don't know what I'm talking about. And so I don't want to mislead anyone and say, oh, this is great or this is terrible, because I just don't have enough experience to be able to say that with any authority. However, I did want to show off the specs for those who are familiar with this kind of setup. So we're looking at an MPP 2.0 SLA and then a level pressure of 4096. And this is all jargon to me. I have no idea what that means, but if you are into styluses and drawing and stuff, I'm hoping this is at least helpful. At the very least, I did install Adobe Fresco just to test it out, and sure enough, yes, the active pen is active. It works. And if I use the tip of the pen, it's going to give you a more sharp kind of texture, and then also I can rub it with the side and get a different texture as well. And again, I'm not super familiar with all this stuff, but at least from a testing perspective, yeah, it seems to be fully functional. So now let's move into something where I actually know what I'm talking about. Let's talk about battery life. To start, this thing charges pretty darn fast. It takes about an hour and 15 minutes to charge from 0 to 100%. I also found that the sleep mode works well. I lost about 1% battery overnight. Now, I tested this with a bunch of games, but here are 5 examples that I think are going to be helpful just in understanding what kind of battery life you can expect from the MinisForum V3. So let's start with the far right, which is going to be our best case scenario. This is going to be with Celeste. This one only requires about a 4-watt TDP, even at a full resolution. And the battery life on this end is pretty great. We got about 5.5 hours of battery life at the end. Moving on, let's talk about mid-grade emulation with Wind Waker HD as our example. This game I'm playing at its native 1080p resolution and its native 30 frames per second, and we got a little bit over 3 hours of battery life, and I still think that is pretty great too. Now in the center, I tested Hades at 2 different power profiles. At 15 watts, we're using the power saving profile, and then at 18, we're using the balanced one. When I played at a 15 watt TDP, I could get an average frame rate of 60 frames per second, and my battery life was 2 hours and 18 minutes. Now at 18 watts, I unlocked the frame rate to give me 125 frames per second, and this gave me about an hour and a half altogether. And when you're on battery power, that's the highest wattage that the MinisForum settings are going to give you. And so for the rest of the testing, that's all I used. It's the same 18 watt power profile, and as expected, I got about an hour and a half of battery life every time. So let's look at our other 2 examples. Here is Doom Eternal, again at 18 watt TDP with the 16p resolution, medium settings, and 60 frames per second, and yeah, same thing, hour and a half. And then finally we have God of War. This is different than the 800p profile that I showed earlier. This time I used 1600p low settings, but with FSR turned on. And the performance here was a little bit worse than what we got at 800p, but the graphics did look quite a bit better. So really, in a worst case scenario, we are capped out by that 18 watt TDP when on battery, which is going to give us an hour and a half of battery life. And this is going to limit the performance in certain games, but you can always use a third-party app to change the TDP manually as well. But for me personally, I found that I was okay with an 18 watt TDP. It allowed me to just go into the settings and really kind of figure out what I could do under those constraints. And I also like the peace of mind knowing that I was going to get an hour and a half of battery life no matter what I did, because it would cap out at those 18 watts. Meanwhile, if you want to cut it down even more by lowering it down to 15 watts or maybe using a lighter weight game, you will definitely get a lot better battery life as well, up to 5.5 hours if you really push it. So all things considered, when it comes to tablet gaming, this is about what I was expecting, and so I have no real issues here when it comes to battery life. It's certainly not going to be as good as something like an ARM-based chip, but all the same, this is what we have to work with under the x86 architecture. Okay, I think this video has been packed with information. This is a lot longer than my typical mini PC review, so let's start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the MinisForum V3. As always, we'll start with what I like, and there's a lot to talk about here. Number 1, I love the fact that it's so thin and sleek. It feels very premium, like made by a really high-end competitor. And so just in general, I've really enjoyed walking around with this tablet over the past week. It feels like it's a really elevated experience. Another thing that elevates that experience is the performance of the Ryzen 7 8840U. This is the first device I've tested with this chipset, and I think it's great. I think that at a lower power profile, like 15 watts, we get some great performance. But then also if we plug it in and push it up to 28 watts, it basically unlocks every single game you can think of. I also love the fact that you only have one choice of specs, and it's the high-end stuff. You've I've got 32 gigs of RAM, a terabyte of storage. And that gives me some peace of mind, knowing the fact that I have a really high-end model. That's a lot of RAM and storage. I also really like this display. It's nice and big, has a high resolution, a good aspect ratio, and also a super high refresh rate. It is a matte screen, which means it's not going to be like super crisp and popping, but all the same, I think the saturation here is still very good. And I also love the fact that it has DisplayPort in, so you can use it as an external monitor if you'd like. And when you look at the competition, I think the pricing here is very good. It gives you more features and performance than some of the others, but at a lower price point. Another thing that really struck me about the whole experience is that I kept thinking to myself that, man, this is a lot like a laptop, but better in many ways. The way I saw it, when I plugged in the keyboard attachment, it felt just as good as any other laptop that I've used previously. However, when I take the keyboard off, it now turns into a tablet, which is something I'm more apt to use than an actual laptop. And so it really did start to change my way of thinking when it comes to a tablet and a laptop. We'll talk about that more at the end of the video. Before that, I do want to talk about some of the things that I don't like, and some of these are very nitpicky, but I did want to bring them up. The first is that I don't like that the keyboard case itself doesn't have very strong magnets. It feels kind of loose. On a device that has so many other premium features, this is one that definitely didn't feel premium. From the software side, I don't have a lot of complaints, but the one I do have is that I wish it had 800p integer scaling. And I know it's possible because we see it on the Lenovo Legion Go, so whatever magic they did, I hope that MinisForum can also replicate. Another thing that was a letdown compared to the rest of the premium package is the audio. It just didn't feel super bassy and clear either. I wouldn't go as far as calling it bad, but it definitely doesn't rise to the occasion of all the other features that we have here in this tablet. I also found it to be a little bit heavy, especially compared to my iPad Pro. Now, obviously this is larger, and so it's going to be a little bit heavier, and it's still quite a bit lighter than a full laptop as well. But all the same, that was something I noticed as I was carrying it around over the past week was, man, this thing definitely has some heft to it. And then finally, this one is nothing to do with MinisForum, but just the fact that a Windows tablet doesn't really feel like a true tablet experience. After so many years of Android and iPad OS, it just kind of comes part and parcel with having a full touchscreen environment. And while yes, this does have a touchscreen and I can definitely tap on the screen whenever I want, it still isn't the same as using a true tablet. I feel like when I was using it, I was constantly reminded that I was using a Windows computer and not an actual tablet. Again, this is a more UI kind of complaint as opposed to something to do with MinisForum, but I wanted to make sure I didn't mischaracterize this as being like a supremely awesome experience in all sunshine and rainbows. Just like when it comes to trying to cram Windows inside of a handheld, there are just some weird compromises here and there. However, all things considered, I kind of fell in love with the MinisForum V3. In fact, like I mentioned just a minute ago, this really kind of changed my way of thinking when it came to tablets in general, especially with Windows. Up until this review, I've always thought about tablets as being something like a consumption device, something where you can browse the internet or maybe watch a movie, but not really much beyond that. Now on Android, you can also do retro game emulation, and it's also great, but nothing really beats being able to play PC games as well. And for me, this is where the MinisForum V3 really shines. I had to keep reminding myself as I was playing these PC games that I was running them natively. There's a part of me that's very used to streaming games over to my iPad or an Android tablet from a real PC. And so I found it to be very refreshing to be able to play these games natively on a tablet, no streaming or anything. In fact, I like the experience so much that now, the next time that I'm in the market to buy a laptop, I'm probably going to be looking at tablets instead. And I think if your situation is similar to mine, that you should maybe consider a tablet as well. This thing can do all the same things a laptop can do, but a bunch of things that a laptop cannot. And on the opposite side, it can do a lot of things that a tablet can do, but a lot of things that a tablet cannot. So the way I see it, if this is within your budget and you are looking for the most functionality possible, then I'm not sure anything can really beat the MinisForum V3. You can definitely buy a laptop for cheaper, and you can also buy a tablet for cheaper, but I'm not sure you could get both of them combined into one at this kind of price point anywhere else. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Among all the different use cases we talked about in this video, which one is the best fit for you? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.